Hey everybody, and welcome to today's Senior Leadership Series on Environment, Pedagogy and Curriculum. My name is Kwame and I'll be the facilitator for today in collaboration with DARPL and the Black Curriculum. Today's session is going to be largely reflective, so if you don't have a pen and paper already or to hand, then it's great to just pause the video now and go and grab one. We are going to talk through a little bit about environment, as you can see, pedagogy and curriculum, but there's going to be a lot of exercises for you to reflect a little bit more in more detail, as well as some written tasks as well. So just pause the video now and go and grab yourself a pen and paper, and then we can continue when we're back. Welcome back. Just tell you a little bit about the Black Curriculum and our aims. So the Black Curriculum was started in 2019, mainly as a social enterprise that was working with young people, bringing them into alternative spaces to learn about Black British history and kind of the more creative forms of education. Since then, kind of we opened up to campaign for, to successfully campaign for Black British history to be made mandatory in the national curriculum, the History National Curriculum, through Key Stage 3. And we also aim to become a national and international parent organisation in resources and programmes in Black British history. And then finally, to be the go-to organisation and brand for Black British history resources and training throughout the world. So we do a few different things. So our work looks mainly at teacher training, curriculum consultation, school workshops and assemblies, the Springboard program, which you can see in the image on the top right there. And mainly what the Springboard program was about, as I mentioned before, was about bringing young people into creative spaces, alternative spaces where we could then engage in acts of history around Black British history. And that might have looked like galleries, museums, so on and so forth, as well as the National Ambassador Scheme, which is about essentially equipping young people with the tools to become ambassadors of their school, to bring about anti-racist education and to embed Black British history in their school-wide curriculum. We also have corporate services for guest speaking and workshops, policy and campaigning for mandating Black British history, as well as some books and podcasts. So if you like to read, if you like podcasts, please check out our Sounds of Black Britain podcast, which is available on Spotify. Really interesting, goes into the history of Black British sound, as well as some books at various ages. You can also take a little look at those. We have Migration Places and Legacies as well. Okay, so I think what we'll do is I wanted to start us off today just by taking a little look at this tube map. You can come back to this tube map at any point in time. Really what the tube map is it's just about the resources that DARPL has available to you for anti-racist education, anti-racist practice. Okay, so whether you're a senior leader, you can see there on the brown line, you can follow that brown line to find different resources that are available on the websites, as well as teachers, governors, and wider staff as well. So please don't hesitate to take a little look at this, find your way around. There's some really great resources on there. We've got some e-learning materials, we've got regular blogs, we've got the DARPL library. It's really, really beneficial. So I thought, let's just frame that now, let's just spotlight that so that those who are interested can go and take a little look and make your own way through some of those resources, okay? So let's start off with a very easy question. What does it mean to be anti-racist, right? What does it mean to be anti-racist? And Ibrahim Kendi says, anti-racism, or the opposite of racist, is not racist. It is anti-racist. One either allows racial inequalities, to persevere as racist, or confronts racial inequalities as anti-racist. So really what we're saying here is that anti-racism is about actively trying to combat racism, right? It's about actively trying to reduce or limit the amount of racist experiences that people have in this world, and saying that it's not enough to simply just be against racism or to not be racist, but acknowledging that there are forces in the world, right? There are forces that cultivate racist belief systems. And as anti-racist educators, our job is to try and combat those forces, but also equip students with the knowledge to be able to critically assess those narratives themselves, and of course, come to understand those narratives as racially motivated or as inciting racism. Okay, so we've got some core principles of anti-racist practice here. Prioritize anti-racism, understand, develop, right? Develop an anti-racist practice, take action, and then review or reflection, right? So what happened with that action? Where do we go? How do we review it? How do we reflect on it? And how do we possibly change our priorities? How do we change our understanding? How do we develop new resources as a way to kind of move forward? And this is a really important consideration, right? Because as the world changes, as multiple iterations or the narrative surrounding racism changes, we also need to be attentive to those changes, right? We need to be attentive to understand the way in which racism functions in society, and through those stages, through being attentive, we can adapt, right? And we can combat racist belief systems. So I think let's start off with a 15-minute professional learning reflection, right? I say 15 minutes, it might take you a little bit less, it might take you a little bit longer, that's absolutely fine. But the main aim here is to really think critically about some of the questions that we have here on the board, right? So the first question is, what professional learning activities has your whole school team completed on shifting from non-racist to anti-racist approaches? And you can take a moment to just write some reflections down. If you haven't, that's absolutely fine. But for those who have, just take a moment to write some of those reflections down, write some of those answers. Secondly, I'm asking today, how are you as a school auditing or recording that all governors and staff have done this, right? So how are you auditing or recording that all governors and staff have themselves completed or are going through various activities to hopefully shift from becoming a non-racist school to an anti-racist school, okay? And the final question today is, what will the frequency of training or revisiting those trainings or those resources be going forward? And how are you addressing these gaps or issues? And those gaps or issues might be around, as we said before, going on anti-racist training, learning, going through anti-racist activities, right? But that also might be gaps, maybe, as we said, if we get to the review stage, the reflection stage, there might be some gaps there as well. So how would you like to address those gaps moving forward? Okay, so we'll pause the video right now and I'll give you about 15 minutes to just write some of those reflections down. And these reflections is really just to get ourselves to think critically about our own anti-racist practice, right? In the next series, we're going to be talking a little bit, it's going to be a little bit more informative, but really today is more about you reflecting on your own practice as it stands. At the end of the day, you are the experts within your classroom, you're the experts of your school-wide community, right? And the communities around your school as well. So it's really important for you to kind of engage with that and think about how your own practice might change going forward. So please pause the video now and we can continue once you come back. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. So for those of you that have completed the exercise, that's great. Hopefully you've got some things down on some paper, and we can move on to the next part of today's session. So today's session, as we said, we're thinking about environment, right? We're thinking about pedagogy, we're thinking about curriculum, and a huge part of school-wide environment, as I'm sure we're all aware of, is policy, right? We can think of policy as a form of architecture that essentially dictates where people can and cannot go. That could be in interpersonal relationships, that could be in professional relationships, but that can also be in school-wide relationships as well, right? So that can be teacher-student dynamics, student-student dynamics, and so on and so forth. So we can think of policy as an architecture, right, in many ways, that allows certain people to move through certain places, right, or act in certain ways or not act in certain ways. So let's take a moment to visit the DARPL policy checker. And again, I think there's some really wonderful resources that DARPL has available. And so part of today's session is also about familiarizing yourselves with those resources, right? Seeing what's out there, so that you don't feel that you have to take this journey all on your own. Okay, so let's take a moment to review the DARPL policy checker. I've allocated around 15 minutes for this. And hopefully the aim of this resource is to inspire and identify relevant anti-racist policies for your learning community. So I want one key question to guide you as you go through this policy checker, right? How does your reflective exercise that you've previously done, right, align with DARPL's policy checker? And would you change anything? Okay, so the reflection that you've previously written. Okay, I want you to think about how does the DARPL policy checker align with some of these wider reflections that you've had, and once you've gone through the policy checker, would you change anything, right? Maybe you didn't have time to touch on policy before. That's absolutely fine. So maybe you might want to, after going through the policy checker, refine your previous reflections by adding some policy notes and things that you found quite interesting going through this checker. So we'll pause the video now. We'll take roughly about 15 minutes for you to go through that booklet and make any notes that you find interesting, and then you can come back and we can continue with the rest of the session. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So hopefully now you've started your initial reflection, and you've also built on that initial reflection by using the DARPL policy checker as a resource to help you refine your own anti-racist practice, right? Your own anti-racist, let's say, roadmap for the future. So really what anti-racist action really comes down to as well, right? And whether that be policy, curriculum, or pedagogy, is the question, how are we humanizing everybody? Okay? How are we humanizing everyone? And the question that we also want to approach this with, right, as a guiding path, right, is how is this reflected in your environment, your pedagogy, and your curriculum? So if you'd like to, you can take a quick pause now, and you can maybe just jot down a few quick notes on how this is reflected in your environment, pedagogy, and curriculum. We are going to be addressing this a little bit more as we progress further forward as well, and we're going to have some very clear exercises for you to do on each of these segments here as well. Okay, so really, how are we humanizing everyone? How are we humanizing everybody? And how is this reflected in your environment, pedagogy, and curriculum? Okay, for those of you that did pause and wanted to just jot down a few notes, that's absolutely great. As I said, we will have time to go back to them in a little bit more detail with a bit more time as we progress through today's session. But I thought it would be nice to just pump the brakes very quickly, and if there's anything coming up for you there, then you'd have the opportunity to note them down. So we'll move on to the next slide. So for those of you that maybe had the opportunity to reflect a little bit on your environment, what I want us to do now is do a quick exercise called stop, start, and continue. Okay, so for your own personal or team action plan, I want you to think about the environment that you have in your school. And that environment can include the material environment, but it can also be the immaterial environment, right? So it can also be the cultural environment as well. Okay, and I want you to think about the practice that you have so far. Is there anything that you would stop? Okay, is there anything that you would start? Right? And then finally, this final one is a little pat on the back. Is there anything that you would continue? You feel, you know what, this is going very well. We've got this right, and we'd like to continue this as we progress forward. So we'll pause very quickly, maybe take 3 to 5 minutes to just carry out this stop, start, continue exercise. So what would you stop doing in relation to your environment, right? Maybe you feel that it's non-racist, or you feel that you might want to stretch it a little bit more. What would you start to do, right? To cultivate an anti-racist environment, and then what would you continue to do as well? Okay, welcome back. And I think this one is a very interesting one, right? When we think about the environment, when we think about the environment both materially and immaterially, and I think I'll give a reference quickly for culture here, and we'll come back to that in the next session. But one of the things that comes up for me is also school exclusions, right? culture of exclusions. Who are we excluding? Why are we excluding individuals, right? So that might be one that might have come up on your own reflections, right? Or it might start some wider reflections as well. But yeah, ultimately, I think in terms of school exclusions and the type of environment that can create, it's a good one to think about when thinking about anti-racist action as well. Okay. So then we might say, how does leadership impact anti-racist action of any school environment? Okay, so first and foremost, leadership creates a willingness to create change, right? I'm sure we're all aware of that. This isn't anything new, right? There's a willingness to create change, and that's one of the many benefits of being a leader, being a school leader, is you have the capacity to create that change. Okay, and I will say here very quickly, it's not easy, right? And certainly we shouldn't be expecting anybody to take that change just because there's a willingness to create change, to do that change alone. Okay, especially if those people that are carrying that burden are themselves impacted negatively by racism. Okay, so really this should be a whole school approach. This should be a team approach, right? The willingness to change, to create change, should be there, and then we should be carrying that load together. So governing bodies and senior leaders' views and perspectives, right? Very important. Very important. And of course, the senior leadership and the governing bodies' views and perspectives ultimately shape a school environment. Okay, so when we think about anti-racism through the lens of leadership, there's a whole world of possibilities that open up for us. Of course, we have school values, right? What are your school values? How are they positioned, right? How are they orientated? Okay, do they include anti-racist approaches? Do they include the values of cultivating an anti-racist environment? And then finally, as we mentioned school policy, thinking about that architecture that really allows for certain behaviors, certain relationships, certain school cultures to come through. Of course, we have inclusive recruitment and admissions practices, right? So in many ways, leadership play a massive role in creating inclusive recruitment practices and recruitment and admission practices. This is really important, and there's been many studies on how essentially diverse workforces actually create healthy workforces and productive workforces. I don't want to fall too much into the productivity trap, but I do think it's really important for us to consider that when we have diverse workforces around us time and time again, it's been proven that we are more productive, there is a healthier workforce at play. Okay, and of course, leadership impacts and creates school expectations for learning and pedagogy. Okay, again, massively important. What students are learning and how they are learning it, right? And really, where there's an opportunity for leadership in terms of cultivating an anti-racist environment, this is very important. In many ways, you can have the best content, you can have the best curriculum, right? But if the pedagogy isn't there, okay, that curriculum can be void in many ways. So thinking about how also not just you're creating content, but how you're conveying that content as well. Okay, we have CPD and staff development, right? The opportunity to create opportunities for your staff to carry on professional development and also kind of overall staff development. And I think it's you know, when we do this, we also speak about whose staff, right? Which staff are you sending for CPD? Are you sending for staff development, right? Often enough, there tends to be a focus on leadership or kind of teachers and so on and so forth. But really, when cultivating a school culture, it's about everybody. So who are you sending on those CPD days? Who are you sending on those staff development days, right? Is really important to reflect on. So we have the approval of extracurricular activities and external speakers. Once again, a great opportunity to bring in really fun and exciting speakers, really fun and exciting extracurricular activities that also lend themselves to understanding the world around them, right? And that's a massive part of becoming an anti-racist school or creating or cultivating an anti-racist environment, okay? Having that opportunity to bring speakers from all over into your school, right? And really letting the students learn from these speakers, seeing these speakers, learn from these speakers, and understanding that there's a whole world out there of many different people with many different opinions, okay? We also have willingness to listen to students, staff, parent, and carer voices. This is really, really important. Okay, number one, listen to student voices, right? In many ways, students are more tapped in to, kind of contemporary politics than some of us, right? They're glued to their phones, and today we live in an age of information, right? So for those of you that maybe aren't on different forms of social media, like myself, I'm not a TikToker. I barely use Instagram, right? But for those people that are on TikTok, Instagram, and all of these different social media sites, really they're getting a lot of information to them very fast, and it's all around them, right? So students are really tapped in with, let's say, contemporary politics, right? Politics and reflections of the time. So it's really great to hear those student voices. And then of course staff voices and parent and carer voices. And parent and carer voices are just an extension of that community, right? It's really important that we give that time to parents and carers so that they can share their thoughts, so that they can share their opinions, and hopefully also help ourselves, help schools develop that anti-racist school environment and develop an anti-racist action plan. And then finally, we also have using data effectively and consistently. Okay, so that data might look like the data that you've collected on racist incidents, for example, right? Checking in with that data, looking over maybe what are the trigger points for that, what happened in that week, both politically speaking, but also within our wider school, right, our wider school community, okay, and then from there developing an action plan to try and stop instances like that from happening again. So using data effectively is really where that review stage comes in that we mentioned before, right? And then you move on to developing an action plan, and then you come back to a stage of reflection. So very quickly now, could you describe your school's level of racial literacy in one word? What do I mean by racial literacy, right? Racial literacy is essentially the act of talking about race in a comfortable manner from a space that understands the way that race works, right? And understands the function that race has in society. Might sound a little bit confusing, so let's pull it back a little bit. Ultimately, racial literacy is about having the confidence to discuss race with leadership, with staff, maybe sometimes with parents, and of course with students as well. Okay, when we cultivate an environment that is racially literate, just like political literacy, right? When we cultivate an environment that is racially literate, what we're not doing is creating an environment that has certain taboos, or I can't say this, or I can't ask a question about this, right? We really want to cultivate an environment where the taboos are taken away, right? We can have conversations with one another, and then we can subsequently learn from one another as well. So when we say a racial literacy environment, that's what we mean, right? A school's level of racial literacy is how well and how comfortably do they talk about race, how well and how comfortably do they talk about racism, and how well and how comfortably do they talk about anti-racism. Okay, so let's just take a quick moment there, and you can describe your school's level of racial literacy in one word, right? And maybe you might want to also add a scale of from 1 to 10. How comfortable or how well do you feel that your school is engaging in racial literacy? Okay, welcome back everybody. So moving on, to our next exercise is pedagogy. So as I mentioned before, pedagogy is integral, as I know we're all aware, is integral to a student's learning experience, right? There are certain forms of pedagogies that work well with students. There are certain forms of pedagogies that don't work well with students, right? When we think about SEN communities, right? Certain pedagogies work well, certain pedagogies don't work well, okay? It's similar when we're thinking about race, anti-racism, right? It's similar when we're thinking about racial literacy and when we're thinking about anti-racism. The pedagogy that you use can have a huge impact on how it is received by your students, by your learning community. Okay, so I want you to just reflect very quickly and use this stop, start, continue exercise around your own pedagogy, right? Or the pedagogy in your wider school. So is there anything that you feel, pedagogically speaking, that you should stop, right? That doesn't lend itself well to cultivating an anti-racist school and an anti-racist learning community? And if that's so, then maybe hit that, you can jot that down under the stop title there. Okay. Sometimes I find that people find it quite difficult for the stop. It doesn't have to be a big grandiose thing, right? It can be something very, very small. Okay, it can be something very, very small. The key thing here is to get us to think and reflect critically around our own practice. Okay, so of course you can put something, you might want to change it later, but the key thing is to reflect critically around our own practice. And in this sense, that practice is pedagogy and a wider school pedagogy as well. So as I said before, so what would you stop doing? Okay, what would you start doing? Yeah, and finding the pat on the back, what would you continue to do? So I'll give you a few minutes now to check in with that, and then when you're done, you can come back. It should take about 5 minutes or so. When you're done, you can come back and we can continue with the rest of today's session. Okay, welcome back everybody. So pedagogy, as I mentioned before, very, very important for thinking about cultivating an anti-racist learning community. So really what we want to be thinking about in tandem with pedagogy is how are we all leaders in creating change for young people? Okay, and we've got some kind of, I would say also pedagogical prompts in some way, right? So caregiver, healer, reformer, advocate, challenger, historian, leader, accountable, okay, buffer. These are all kind of, let's say, acts, right, or tools that we have within our toolkit, within our pedagogical toolkit. Okay, so when we're thinking about pedagogy, when we're thinking about anti-racist pedagogy, we're also thinking about some of these tools that we have to engage in discussions, to engage in conversation, to engage in class material from a space that cultivates not just anti-racist learning, right, but cultivates, let's say, an environment of mutual respect for one another, right? And mutual inquiry with one another, okay? And on that note, we also think about how we all leaders in creating change for young people, right? And this is something for us to think about as senior leaders, right? Who else are leaders in your school? Okay, who else are leaders in your school? Okay, and who's in proximity to young people? And this is a nice way for us to just shift that viewpoint a little bit from more of an institutional viewpoint to also one that is thinking from the level of community. So, for example, when I was in school, I would also very much say that the as we said back then, the dinner ladies themselves were school leaders, right? They were the ones that were out on the playground. They were the ones that were talking and chatting with the students, right? They were the caregivers in that situation. Yeah. And so I think it's a nice way for us to think about how we are all leaders in our own rights and who are the leaders are in our schooling environment, right? In our learning community, whether or not they carry the title of leader or not, and what's their role in cultivating an anti-racist schooling environment. Yeah, just some quick reflections and some quick prompts there. So moving on, and we're closing up with today's session. There's been a lot of kind of reflective work here. Don't worry if you haven't managed to get too much down. The main point is just engaging in that act of reflection, right? And continuing that act of reflection after today's session has ended, right? It's just about kind of creating it, making it kind of I don't want to say impulsive, but as we'll see later, these acts of reflection, little and often, okay, little and often to see the direction that we're heading in. So our final reflection is going to be around the curriculum. Okay, so I want you to think again around what would you stop doing in the curriculum currently? Okay, what would you stop doing that you think, maybe this isn't working? Again, I'll always say that this doesn't necessarily mean that what you're doing in the curriculum is racist or non-racist or whatever, but it's important to think around maybe it's just not working. Maybe we need to think from the level of curriculum, from a different level, from a different standpoint. Maybe it would work better. Okay, so what would you stop doing? What would you start to do given the opportunity? Okay, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you start to do? Again, curriculum specific, right? In your curriculum, what would you start to do? And then finally, what would you continue to do, right, as you move forward? And I know many of you may not necessarily this might not be your first stage of cultivating an anti-racist school environment or even cultivating an anti-racist curriculum, and that's great. So this is your opportunity to think about what you've done well, right, when you continue to do that. What have you done well? Okay, and it's also an opportunity to think about, well, maybe I'm not there yet, right? And I think that goes for everybody and anybody, right? As I said, the world is always changing. The various narratives surrounding race are always changing, and therefore we also need to be attentive of these narratives. So a change, like what you stop doing, doesn't necessarily mean that it's because you've got something wrong, but it means that the context and the environment has changed, and therefore we need to respond to that context and environment. Okay, so take 5 minutes just to pause now. Your stop, start, continue exercise. If you can do more than one for each, that's absolutely brilliant. The more the merrier. Okay, and we'll continue when you come back. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So what we're going to do now then is I'm just going to talk us through a little bit around curriculums, how we might design our curriculums. Again, this isn't a one size fits all, absolutely not. This is just some wider reflections on curriculum implementation. All right, so timetable opportunities for safe, brave, and open conversations about race. Okay, really important, really, really great. As I said, often enough our students are so informed. It's when we open up the discussion with them, it can be a little bit mind blowing. So students want to talk about these things. They want to talk about what's happening in their immediate environments, what's happening politically, both regionally and nationally, and also sometimes internationally as well. Okay, so creating those timetable opportunities for those open, safe, and brave conversations around race is a great way to think about how we might embed anti-racism within the curriculum without it being explicitly concerned with a subject, so to speak. Okay, and it's also a really great way to, let's say, dissolve some of those power relationships, right? Some of those power dynamics. Okay, when we're talking about popular culture, current events, right? Students also very much have an opinion about those as well, and so it's a nice way to step back and hear those opinions without students feeling like they're being judged on a particular topic that you might be teaching. Okay. So including resources and examples which represent diverse societal and historical perspectives. Okay, really, really great and really important. And there's so much that can be done with this, right? And this can be done both within the context of regionally, right? And it can also be done within the context of nationally and internationally, but including those resources and those examples which kind of represent diverse and societal and historical perspectives is really, really great. And what that does is that also introduces our students to educational materials that are often enough don't come along with particular sets of, let's say, traumas, right, or grievances. So you can also think about this as a way to prepare your students for maybe some of the more difficult conversations around race that might come later in their schooling practice as well. Okay. And of course, you can anticipate and sensitively address topics, right, resources and activities which may be traumatic for students. So as I said before, if we think about the inclusion of resources from different ages, from primary to secondary, right, that celebrate world history, right? The diversity of societies. Um, what we're doing is we're anticipating um, what's to come later. And then, of course, we also, and this is where pedagogy comes into play, we also kind of sensitively address these topics, right? The same with the resources that we're bringing into the classroom as well. And I have an example here of an image that was taken. And this is supposed to represent some people being taken or force marched from the interior of West Africa, possibly northern Ghana, northern Benin, Burkina Faso, somewhere like that, and taken down to the coast. So let's say, for example, Ghana, Benin, or Togo. Now, what is in an image? Right? And this is the question that we have to be asking ourselves. An image like this, we would say, is not necessarily what you want to be putting up on the screen for the classroom. Okay, I'm using this image as a reference point for everybody here to say that we need to be conscious of the type of images that we're bringing into the classroom, okay, and the type of scenes that we're depicting with these images, okay, and that's where the sensitivity comes into play, because I would say that this image could prove to be traumatic, right, for anybody in the classroom, right, irrespective of how they're racialized, and it will be especially traumatic for people that are racialized as having African or Afro-descendant ancestry. Okay, so thinking about the images that we're bringing into the classroom, thinking about the resources that we're bringing into the classroom, really important. I was reading an article not too long ago. Actually, it was an ethnography. It was a research project done in a school, and it was essentially it was about how slavery was being taught in a classroom in England in 2020, and essentially they put roots on and they discussed roots with the students, and they paused it at a very traumatic and violent scene, and the teacher didn't seem to realize that it was paused at a very traumatic and violent scene. And a lot of people had issues with this, and the researcher kind of flagged this up, and then later they engaged in a role-playing exercise of essentially of carrying out and role playing what it was like to let's say be somebody that's enslaved at that time, and also what it was like to own slaves at that time. So there was these power dynamics that were being played out, and the article itself was looking at humor and how black students used humor during these sessions to distance themselves from the more traumatic and painful representations of slavery, but also to distance themselves from the history of slavery that was being brought up for them by virtue of them being black and by virtue of them talking about their shared history. So they use humor as a way to distance themselves from this particular part of history. So really, really interesting paper. And I think it's titled "If She Moves, I'll Whip Her," which was a quote that one of the black students used in reference to another black student when engaging in the role-playing act. And it's a difficult read, but nonetheless a very important read for thinking about pedagogy and thinking about how we might bring resources into the classroom. Okay. Finally, support for students and of course support for staff, right? To accurately understand the colonial forces that have shaped contemporary mainstream thought, racism, and racial inequalities. And don't worry, for now, we will come back to that in later sessions with DARPL as well, for those of you that will go on to the Enhanced Leadership, Senior Leadership series, thinking about the way in which knowledge is produced and thinking about the way in which colonization and, let's say, a particular canon of knowledge during the period of, let's say, the 1600s up to the 1900s, right, was written from a very particular standpoint, right, and that standpoint was a standpoint of imperialism and colonization, which portrayed certain peoples, certain worlds, certain cultures, certain customs in quite a derogatory light, in a way that bolsters the colonial expansion. Okay, and I won't go into too much detail now. I mean, you can definitely search up the relationship between colonization and knowledge production in Google, and you'll find some really interesting stuff. But for those of you that maybe will come later to the Enhanced Leadership series, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So when thinking about curriculum, when thinking about building an anti-racist curriculum, I want us to take 10 minutes to review the building an anti-racist curriculum for secondary schools, or if you're here from a primary school, the anti-racism in the curriculum resource, right? So take a moment to go through these resources, familiarize yourselves with these resources. And as you do so, I want you to take note of how does this relate to your own curriculum design? How does it relate to your own curriculum design currently? And maybe even before your anti-racist journey? Is there anything that you inside that has prompted wider reflection on curriculum design? Like, or is there anything you thought, that's really, really interesting, and I wonder how that might relate to my own school? Okay, if so, take a moment, write it down. You know, even if it's just a stream of consciousness, it doesn't have to be finished and proper and great. Okay, the main thing is that we're, as I said before, we're engaging critically in our own practice, and we're getting some of that information out there in note form so we can come back to it later. Okay. And then finally, do you want to change anything to your stop, start, and continue reflection? Okay, so after going through this resource, do you want to change anything to your stop, start, and continue reflection? Do you want to change what you might stop? Do you want to add something? Do you want to change what you might start, right? Or do you want to change what you might continue? And again, this is for us building on those deeper reflections that we've had, right? And thinking about the opportunity for cultivating an anti-racist practice. And these are some really, really great resources. So please don't be shy. Take a little look at them. And when you're done, you can come back and we'll close up today's session. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. So really, when we're thinking about curriculum, there's a few main things that we want to do here, right? We want to cultivate critical thinking, right? We want to cultivate critical thinking in our students, and we also want to cultivate critical thinking for ourselves. Okay, so here's a nice little kind of short way for us to think about how we might do that, okay? And that is the BAT, right? So whenever we come to resources, whether we're choosing resources in our curriculum, right, or whether we're discussing these resources with our students, we want to think, is it balanced? Okay, do multiple sources agree? Yeah. Another way of thinking is this source biased? As I was saying before, when we think about this particular time period between colonization, okay, a lot of these sources that we have are are biased. Okay, so we can tease that out, we can discuss how they might be biased, why they might be biased, okay? Then we also might want to think about, is it accurate, right? Did they see the events directly? Are they an expert or a specialist in this particular field of study? Okay, if the answer is yes, right, then we can come to the, is it balanced? Do multiple sources agree? If the answer is no, are they potentially biased? In what ways might they be biased? Okay, and then finally, is it trustworthy? Can the source be trusted? Who benefits from telling the story this way? Okay, these are some really great questions for us to think about when we're creating our curriculums, but also when we're in the act of discussing these resources with our students as well to help them cultivate critical thinking. And finally, a little bit around bias and the way that that might come in. So as critical thinkers and educators, we are aware of our own cognitive biases and personal prejudices, and also how they influence what appear to be objective responses and solutions and decisions, right? So really for ourselves as educators, we need to be enhancing our own awareness of biases, right? Um, and in doing so, enhancing our own critical thinking skills. Okay. In doing this, what we're doing is we're thinking again critically, right? But we're also beginning to challenge resources, to think a little bit around resources in more detail, and think how they might be perpetuating, let's say, non-racist or racist belief systems, but also showcasing to our students that that we bring materials into the classroom to critically engage with them and not accept them as absolute truth. Okay, and of course it is of course age relevant, right? But as your students progress to higher forms of education, this is really what examination bodies, schooling bodies, higher education institutes are going to be looking for as well. So when reviewing content, your curriculum and your lessons, I want you to just very quickly think and maybe note down, how often do you apply critical thinking? How often do you apply critical thought? Okay, you can pause the video here and we'll come back in a second. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully you've just written down in your lessons, in your curriculums, how often do you apply critical thinking, right? And essentially, how does that manifest itself within the classroom? And how often do you ask your students to do this as well? Okay, that's a really important question. How often do you ask your students to do this? So some final thoughts, as I mentioned before, by habits. So little and often, opportunities to practice anti-racism consciously. Okay, now whether that be from an environmental standpoint, the environment, the material and immaterial environment, as I mentioned before, right? From a pedagogical standpoint, right? Or from a curricular standpoint, okay? Little and often, but most importantly, by habit. And the more you do it little and often, the more you cultivate that habit. Okay, and really what we're trying to do is empower, right? Give critical thinking skills to our students and our staff, and as well, in doing so, creating an anti-racist environment, right? And ultimately, you should feel confident, you should feel safe, you should feel informed, and you should feel supported. And of course, so should the rest of your staff as well. So I'll just say thank you very much, everybody. Next time, we're going to be looking very broadly at leadership, environments, and the measurement of anti-racist action. Okay, and maybe some of the pitfalls of measuring anti-racist action as well. And so I'll just say thank you for joining. I hope that you found today's session, at the very least, an opportunity to reflect on your own practice. And I look forward to continuing in the next series with you. Thank you.
If you would like to continue your anti-racist professional learning journey with DARPL, please consider joining our Enhanced Leadership series. This is a series of 6 professional learning days with a combination of in-person and virtual learning. We run 2 cohorts each academic year, with cohorts in North and South Wales each time. To register, please click the link on the slide or visit the DARPL website for more information. If you would like continued support and guidance for your learning organisation, please consider joining the DARPL Advocacy Network. Each associated learning organisation is able to request bespoke professional learning which can be linked to their school improvement or development plans to support them to become anti-racist learning organisations. For more information on becoming a DAN school, please click the link and complete the inquiry form.